Well, welcome back to the One Big Thing podcast. I'm Steve Campbell, your host. The prior guests that I've had on the show are now starting to get very competitive, as I've shared a couple of times. When I finish an episode, I always ask the guests, like, as you're going to hear from my guest, Joe, today, Joe, how was your experience? And they usually give me some great feedback. And I ask them, who do you know in your world that I could be interviewing? My guests have all been referring multiple names of people, but now my incoming guests are starting to refer people that they know because we've had a FaceTime call or I've laid out the vision for this show and they're like, hey, you got to interview this person. So Joe Gagnon, who we have on today, he is a guest, a friend of another guest on the show, and we had an opportunity to talk in the car, and immediately I knew he would be a great interview. And so, Joe, for those who don't know you, I want to give you some time here at the beginning to share a little of who you are. But if you're a friend, a family member of Joe, and this is your first time on the One Big Thing podcast, this is an interview style show where I interview people from all walks of life. You get to hear their stories, but it really culminates with the big life lessons that they've learned that can hopefully inspire you to live your best life and to move the ball forward. So if you're here for the first time, I'd love for you to check out the other guests I've had on. They all have remarkable stories, and they make us realize that we're all humans. We're all figuring this thing called life out. And there's maybe some life hacks and some ways of doing things that can helpfully help you become the person you want to be. But Joe, for those that don't know you, do you want to give us kind of a high level overview of who you are?
Yeah. Steve, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I always enjoy and appreciate the opportunity to share sort of the story and the journey. It's always interesting. It's easier to tell our stories when we're looking back rather than our prospective view of how life could be. You remember like, oh my God, I was a kid who went to school in the Bronx for 8 years. Like I didn't really have much going on. I was one of those who in high school, didn't have a date and was we know now called Bullied and made fun of, and worked hard to get through college, get my first job, and it all started off pretty hard because car was stolen, girlfriend breaks up with you, move back into your parents' basement, have no money, you have college debt, and you're like, oh my God, is this the beginning of the end, right? And so I always tried to sort of contextualize the rest of my journey around that every moment is then the beginning of the future, right? Rather than what happened before. And so years later, what did I become? I worked in the software world for many, many, many years. I became a bit of an explorer, an adventurer, a writer and a creator. I realized that, in fact, the only permission I needed to live the life that I wanted to live was giving myself permission to sort of lean into all the capabilities I had that I didn't know. And so that was by hanging out with smart people. That was by volunteering to do things that you didn't even know what you were going to get yourself into, and just sort of having a willingness to try and learn from the experience. So, throughout the journey, then, I did get married. I'm still married. I have two beautiful daughters. So I've held together the family piece. I've done the work stuff, and I became an endurance athlete along the way. And we can talk more about that. But that was another part of sort of developing who I am as a person, by finding that when you dig into the depths of challenge and suffering, hard things, that you might show up and surprise yourself. You don't need a lottery ticket. You sort of get it when you're born, decide whether you're going to cash it or not. And I decided to cash mine.
Well, and as you and I were talking leading up to the show, I said, I just want to warn you, this show is not just all about the high water marks that we can all champion and use social media to do. I think listeners are here because they want to hear, not necessarily that you were bullied or picked on or went through things, but it humanizes you.
Yeah.
And again, if you just looked at Joe's life today and the things he's working on and the things he's championing, it could easily create a level of isolation or distance between the two of you because you can feel like I'm paying student loans. I feel broken. I feel picked on in school or in the workplace. And here's this guy, this endurance athlete, the CEO. He's doing things, he's moving things, and I just don't feel like I can connect. Maybe in Joe's story, in this brief introduction, which was incredible, I think Joe just gave you like every chapter of his life in rapid fire that can identify with all of us and what we're going through. But even something that you just said here at the beginning that I think is important is, yes, you went through bullying and you went through people picking on you. You had your car stolen. You had to move back in with your parents. these are all things that could easily have shaped you. But now, as
Mm.
you said, looking back, you surrounded yourself with people who were maybe smarter than you or doing better things than you. And it probably began to reform and reshape your identity from maybe what others growing up had kind of put on you. So talk to us then
Mm.
about kind of what you're working on today, because you're doing some pretty incredible things. So I think it's good, yes, to humanize you, but I think it's also good to present that not that any one of us would say we're an authority on things, but you have done some pretty incredible things, which I think gives a little bit of credence to some of the things we'll talk about today.
Yeah, and I think, Steve, the part of the way to success is having a little bit of patience too, right? I mean, there
Mhm.
is like, I don't know, if you set out to go run a mile or a marathon or lift some weights or become a CEO. These things are just going to take some time to develop, and we actually have a lot of time in our lives, so we should sort of appreciate the process and the journey. And so, I went through my career with ever increasing levels of responsibility, understanding what that meant, to the point where I did become, a first time CEO about almost 20 years ago. And that set up me for, the possibilities of, building and leading companies. And while I was going on that journey, I was trying to create a strong foundation for myself, right? Because you carry a burden, the more responsibility you take on, whether that's at a family level, a work level, and a community level. If you're going to shoulder the load, then you have to have the strength to do that. And that's the integrity of these five pillars that I understand now, which is, sleep and mindset, community, exercise, and nutrition, and really focusing on how each of those levers, which we control, allow us to do that. So, yeah, I've become a CEO of a health data company, which is fantastic because it works on the infrastructure of how we could improve health in the United States. But then it syncs up with what I've been doing for 25 years, which is really keeping track of all of my activities, my athletic activities, and all of the other things I've been doing, to see how I develop. So the data has been really important to knowing progress. And I've tracked, Steve, I wrote down in just a spreadsheet, my accountability partner, what I've done over the past 25 years every day. And in that, you start to see progress, which the patience thing then intersects well. And you're like, oh, wow, if I stick to this, 1 year I did a mile, the next year I did 20, the next year I did 50, the next year I did 100. And you start to see this happen. And that's why I think people, can believe in you. If you can show both on your personal life and your professional life how you can make a commitment and follow through, then a lot of people are going to ask you to take on responsibility, for either running their company or running a project or just helping them out, in a race. So they're all connected, the same sort of elements of what we learn along the way. And, yeah, it's been really quite a blessing and and a lot of excitement along, this journey.
Yeah, and one thing that you just talked about is the burden of responsibility. And you may never be a CEO of a company, so maybe that's an area that you don't understand. But if you're a parent, if you're married, if you're just trying to figure out life, there's responsibility that's on you. And sometimes, again, I've talked about on this show, if we're not careful, instead of being a blessing, these things can become actual true burdens because it becomes such a weight and pressure that we may not feel qualified or able, whether it's because of our own disbelief, whether it was because we had words spoken over us by an authority figure when we were a kid, a school teacher, a coach, even, God forbid, a parent that made us feel like you're never good enough. You're not going to be
Mm.
able to do this. Maybe they didn't even intentionally mean to do this, but maybe you had shared growing up a dream that you had for something that you'd love to become. And a parent said, Joe, be realistic. You're not built for that, or I don't think you can do that. Because as
Right.
parents, we are always trying to help our kids. But maybe you've been struggling with this sense of, belief and ability and feeling the weight and the burden. But I want to tie that to the fact that you just said there are things that we can control in our life. You cannot
Mhm.
necessarily control the way that the burden manifests, the way that your employees respond, the way that your kids respond, but you can control how you respond and how you prepare yourself for those opportunities. And I think what's neat about your story, which I'd love to get into, is you talked about those five pillars in health. I think sometimes we neglect the health
Mm.
component to life, which if you're neglecting that part of your life and you don't feel good about yourself, you feel overweight, or you feel like you're not taking care of yourself in the gym or running, it's crazy how that, whether you realize it or not, can begin to seep into and influence how you are as a leader or as a parent. So you've been tracking for 25 years, probably well before these apps came out, things you do in that journey. And one thing you talked about that I'd love for you to get into, because it's something I think many of us struggle with, is the idea of accountability. I
Yeah.
think so many of us are trying to bury this burden by ourselves, and just maybe talking through why you felt it was a need to get an accountability partner,
Mm.
kind of what that looked like, what were the qualifications that other person needed to have that made you say this is somebody that's trustworthy. So talk to me about accountability, and then we'll shift kind of into the importance of taking care of yourself health wise.
Yeah. I think that when I was 29, Steve, I had a guy who had a lot of respect for. He said that, the priority in life is you take care of yourself first, your family second, and your work third. Because if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of the other two. And I was like, I felt, wow, that's awfully selfish. And then over time, I realized that if I didn't take care of myself, I didn't show up well for either of the other two.
Hmm.
And so that's a really important early life lesson. It's not being selfish when you take enough time to sleep, you eat properly, you exercise, you take some time to do the things that matter to you. There's 168 hours in the week. We can fit it all in. Anyone who says they don't have enough time should just do sort of a time-based analysis of how you use your time during the week. It's a very practical perspective. But if you don't invest, then what happens is you show up very poorly. You're upset, you're a little bit tired, you're angry. These are things that we can work on. And so I learned at 29 years old that I was going to be the person taking care of me, right? And once I did that, now that didn't solve the problem. Like I had to go work on it. But it was that insight that was really, really important to me. The second part, which you said, is the accountability partner. I actually put one thing before that, which is this idea of when you make a commitment, you need to think about it to yourself before you make it to anyone else. And so you should consider the implication when you make a commitment. Hey, Steve, I'm going to go meet you next week to do something. Then you have to figure it out. Oh, that could fit into my schedule. Like I can't call you that day and say, oh, by the way, Steve, 5 other things came up. So commitment first to yourself, then to others. And then the accountability partner, it doesn't have to be a person. In the beginning, mine was a spreadsheet. And I just made sure that I filled it out every day, just like you would do anything else. And I found that repetition created a habit that was self reinforcing. I actually enjoyed writing it down. It was like this accomplishment. I was like, oh my gosh, I did 10 push ups today and I walked a mile. That was so exciting to write it down and acknowledge it. It wasn't, what did it take? 25 seconds? It wasn't a big time commitment. But that accountability spreadsheet, I didn't like when I didn't do it. If I missed a day for some reason, I was like, oh my gosh, I felt like a little bit of emptiness and something was missing. And so little by little, I started building these habits. I know there's a lot of books written on habit, but actioning habits is more than just understanding them, right? It's actually figuring out, everyone says, well, if you want to start running, then put your clothes out the night before. If you want to eat better, then actually create the menu the day before for the next day. So you do it when you're not hungry and you can do it in a thoughtful way. It's all of these small changes that we make that are within our grasp that we can actually do something about. And we give ourselves grace. It doesn't mean everything is perfect. It doesn't mean that, oh my gosh, I can't have some ice cream or I can't miss a day. Right? Those are all human. Those are fine. But it's on the totality and the average up that we start to see real progress. And so, yeah, that all worked from starting with the prioritization through to the commitment and then the accountability.
Love everything that you just shared in there, because there's so much truth. And there was a great book by Simon Sinek that said start with why. I read it almost a decade ago, and it
Yep.
was mostly about your workplace and what you do, and basically like, why should anybody believe in you if you don't have a strong core conviction as to why you do what you do. But I
Mm-hmm.
think as much as that was written for workplace and what we do, I think it actually, part of the breakthrough that I've had in my life is something that you just said. When you attach a why behind something that you would like to accomplish, if you are a mom or dad that's out there right now and your life is running from ball field to ball field and eating, a goldfish left over from your kids, and you're not even making food for yourself, you may not feel great or wonder why intimacy doesn't exist in your marriage, or why you don't feel like going to the beach, or why you don't feel like, whatever it may be. And it's because of those small things that you've been allowed to creep in that has been destroying your sense of identity and how you feel about yourself. We can all say, like, I want to be in better shape, lose weight, eat less calories, track my macros, all these things that I think there are so many resources out there today that are newer school than, Joe, your way of doing it 25 years ago in an Excel spreadsheet,
Sure.
but we don't use them. And
Yeah.
why? I think it's because we haven't attached a why to it.
Yeah.
Yes, you want to lose weight, but maybe you want to lose weight so you can live long enough to be around your children and see their children's children and feel your best. And that's the difference between when you go to grab something that isn't healthy for you and you're like, shoot, stop. Because if you don't have a why attached to it, you will self-soothe anything that one of my guests, Chris Cannon, talked about with men, and when they teach men to work through rehabilitation because they've struggled with things like pornography or infidelity or alcoholism. He talks about, what is the thing in your life that isn't saying no to you? And it was such a powerful interaction between us. So I was like, Chris, what does that mean? He said, Ben and Jerry's doesn't say no. Jack Daniels doesn't say no. Things you look at the internet don't say no, but your wife says no. Your
Mm.
kids say no. Your boss says no. And if you find that you go after the things that never say no to you, then you are compensating through self-soothing, probably this identity crisis that you have, that you're not the person you want to be. But even as you shared in your story, you have this level of putting a why behind it, but then accountability. One of the shifts that I made, and really has been my heart's passion, is I grew up a very heavy set kid. And I had the ability to play sports my entire life, even went into NCAA Division I sports, but I blew my knee out. Fatherhood happened. I got married, put on some weight.
Mm.
And then I just got to a point of looking at myself in the mirror where I wasn't happy. And part of why I created this content as a podcaster is to basically live out for you guys what I'm trying to figure out myself. And a couple of weeks ago, I kind of raised my hand and was like, hey, so this message is for men. Any men or dads out there that aren't, feeling like they're fully alive, they're not taking care of themselves, they're not being the men they're supposed to be as dads, as husbands, financially, they wish they were doing things. No idea, Joe, if anybody cared, but the overflow of messages I got through
Yeah.
text, through
Right.
Facebook, of people saying, like, I'm all in. Tell me what I got to do. I think we're all trying to navigate how to be better. Some of us have the self-discipline, which it sounds like you have because of
Mhm.
the going back to it, to will yourself to do things that you're supposed to do. There are some people, though, that getting in front of a spreadsheet is not enough of an impact to make them feel like they're taking momentum. So one thing that I talk to people about, and I did personally for myself, was actually having another man as an accountability partner.
Mhm.
We met, we talked and said, like, hey, we are not the weight we want to be. We're not in the shape. We're in shapes, but we're not in the shape that we want to be right now. Like, hey, how can we do this? And we decided that I've been training by myself for the last 2 years, 4 days a week, just me and my music in the morning. But he said, hey, I need to get back in the gym. And so he could either go work out at 7 and I work at 5 in the morning, or we could do it together.
Yeah.
And so we're just a couple weeks in, but we've been training together, no headphones, doing life, talking in between sets. And there has been unintended fruitfulness or blessings that has even come from that, of the depth of impact that as two men were making, or as two ladies or whatever.
Yeah.
And now that has turned into, we're texting each other at night like, hey, I'm down 2 pounds, or I'm feeling great. My wife said I look skinnier. And all of a sudden there's this intentionality to life, which is then when you feel like maybe you want something is not good for you. Now all of a sudden you have something behind it that says, like, no, because I got to check in with this person, or this isn't serving my purpose. Without those things, you will say yes to everything. And so in your journey doing health data, talking about these 5 pillars, has there been anything that you've seen that can help somebody jumpstart out of a place of feeling like, I don't feel good about myself? Let's pause to hear a word from our sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Ditch the Suits podcast. If you're looking to get the most from your money in life, Ditch the Suits has to be your go-to source. Your hosts, Travis Moss and Steve Campbell, they'll talk to you about financial planning topics that nobody in the financial services industry wants you to know about. They're going to expose news and media and headlines because there's no fluff and absolutely no sugarcoating. Just relevant topics that can empower you to get the most from your money and your life. Listen to Dish the Suits today on all major podcast platforms.
Yeah, I think the irony, Steve, and I think it's beautiful what you've done and said, and is that if you can't do it for yourself and you can partner with someone and do it for them, you actually might just feel better, and then you'll get the benefit. And
Yeah.
so sometimes we're a little bit too selfish, like well, I can't do that, and we're so. But if someone says to us, "Can you help me?" I don't know many humans who won't say yes. So part of that
Yep.
is this breakthrough of just spinning it the other way, which is, hey, look, I'm going to the gym with my friend to help him because he needs someone. And by the way, Steve gets a benefit. So now he gets both of you get this benefit. If you can't convince yourself to be the inviter, then go to support someone. If you think you were good at what you used to do, then go coach someone, teach them, take them and show them how to do the weights. If you know how to run, do that. If you just want to go for a walk or play pickleball. And so I think that the community pillar isn't about broad community only. Community could be two people, right? This is about the connection amongst us. The power of how our neuromodulators, neurotransmitters work when we're connected with other people is amazing. The oxytocin, serotonin levels go up. When we do that, we feel healthier and better. It's the same as our dopamine system, right? Which is a motivation system. When these things are working, we just feel better. Sometimes we don't know how to explain it, but the actual activities are what change sort of the dynamic, and it becomes self-reinforcing. The more you do it, that day that you're just a little bit tired, but you know that your friend's going to be there, you're going to show up because he's going to be there. And you break through those moments when we would have a lot of excuses. So yeah, I found that, and it doesn't mean it's permanent over our lifetime. There's moment, the next 2 years you do this with your buddy, and then 3 years after that, you do it in another way with maybe you joined a running club or a CrossFit club. We're talking exercise a lot, but any of this is the way to sort of break through a little bit of our own, sort of personal issues, because we're really good when we help others.
And I don't, and you might, hear these terms that Joe's saying is like, I don't really know what we're talking about. But if you've ever had a feeling with your spouse or a best friend where you almost finish each other's sentences, and when you
Mm-hmm.
recall a moment, my wife and I just had celebrated 11 years of marriage back in
Congrats.
June. Thank you very much. And we got a chance to get away, thanks to my mother and father-in-law, even just for one night without our 4 kids, and have dinner. And this is what's funny, 37 years old. We had dinner reservations at 8 o'clock. That when you're in your
Woohoo.
late 30s, it might as well have been midnight. But we prepared, we went out to dinner, and we probably, Joe, had the most fun we've had in 2 hours. Just no cell phones, sitting at a
Mm,
table. And as we looked back over the last 11 years, which have not been easy, there has been moments that seem so overwhelming.
yeah.
We've relocated so many times. We've been through financial stresses. We've brought 4 kids into this world. But here we are at a dinner, hanging out and recounting, like, hey, you remember when we went through this? And she's laughing. Now I'm laughing. And I go to say the punchline and she says it with me. And all of a sudden, my brain, like, my emotional dopamine kicks in where it's like, man, life is good. But there are days when it doesn't feel that great. There are days when you can feel so alone that nobody sees you. And here we are, many of us, I'm 37, a lot of our listeners are in their 30s, their 40s. They could be CEOs, they could be HR representatives, they could be entrepreneurs, they could be stay-at-home moms or dads. You can be surrounded by people that you honestly love and appreciate and still feel very alone. You're doing a lot of things to take care and nurture those under your care, whether it's employees or kids. But there are times when, especially, and this is what I would say, my experience has been when I don't feel good about myself, like you said, a couple minutes ago, the prioritization of me, my family, and work can sound very selfish, because we're not saying, when we say take care of yourself, like just neglect your family and go do you for, a week at a time. But just like Joe said, taking care of your body, training, weight training, running, so that you are your best and can show up and you're not feeling sick, lethargic, down, depressed. When I feel most isolated, it is when I'm not feeling good about myself.
Mm.
It is very rare that when I feel great, I think I look good. I think I've taken care of myself. All of the actions that I've taken have led up to me feeling my best. People say, Steve, you look awesome. What are you doing? Work is going great. I'm getting everything done. We're rolling out things and it's working well. It's very rare that in those moments when I'm by myself, I feel alone.
Right.
And so it's very revealing that when you feel like you're accomplishing these tasks, you can feel on top of the world versus when you feel stuck. So let's take a little bit of time because you had talked about on one of your other, which Joe, why don't you give a shameless plug here for your podcast? I know that you do a lot of podcasting. I
Yeah.
love when I have other content creators. Why don't you tell everybody about how they can check out your show and what it's about?
Oh yeah, Chasing Tomorrow is the name of the podcast. I've been doing it for 3 years. Similar to Steve, in a way to you, I've been talking to. I always call it intriguing people doing extraordinary things. That could be everyone though, from an Olympic athlete to someone who was 450 pounds and lost 250 pounds and got hold of their life. So it's people's life stories. It's on the typical podcast platforms. I've been writing for every day for 11 and a half years it's called the Living the High Performance Life blog. You can find it on my website. Subscribe if you want. You get a daily paragraph about something that's sort of, I write to myself, I write to the world about sort of motivational perspective, framing issues. I did this gravel bike race this past weekend, which over 200 miles was hard. There's no question about it. My hands still hurt days later. And I wrote about sort of, the translation of, riding on gravel to life. There's these bumps. But, one thing, Steve, I was thinking as you were talking is that I think sometimes we have to train ourselves to appreciate the struggle as much as anything.
Mhm.
And I learned this from my daughter when she was young. She said to me, Dad, you got to learn to love the rain. And, we're all so afraid of going out in the rain. So she would say, let's go for a walk in the rain. And who's going to say no to their daughter, right? I'm like, pretty much no one. And then you're like, because you'd be like, oh, it's raining. I'm not going outside. And then we would just have such fun being out in the rain. So we get soaking wet. What's the big deal? Like we would come back and change and be dry soon enough. And she taught me how to understand the struggle so that now, like when it's really bad weather, I love it. It's like my favorite time. Like sometimes I hope for bad weather because I want to go out and experience the struggle because it reminds me of the learning that I had, which is that, for the most part, it's not tragic. I know there's some moments in our lives that are very, very difficult, but most of them are not. And it's the context and the mindset that we bring to that. And so, for all of the listeners, find something that's a little bit more difficult that you might not ordinarily do. And if you find yourself saying no, go try it. It's just, before you realize it, you're going to be back in your warm home with a cup of coffee or some food, your feet up, something else to do. Um, but every time we do that, we teach our system to appreciate the struggle of life because life is a combination of all. So we want to embrace it the best way we can, and our mindset improves over time, and then we just show up better again and again.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that we put in the show notes Chasing Tomorrow podcast so you guys can head over and champion Joe and start following what he did. But I wonder about in our life what we think our kids are going to remember about us and what they
Mm.
actually will. And will they remember the fact that you did all the things? You cleaned the house, you got them ready, you went to their games. Yes. But what if it was the time you and dad or you and mom went out in the rain? And that's the memory that they hold on to. I think sometimes we struggle as people, not with evil or sin or doing wrong things, but it's just saying no to things that can keep us young and make us feel creative. And one of the things that we went through, kudos to my colleagues, is we went through an exercise. We have what's called ownership groups in
Mm.
our day, which is basically staff members that have a passion or a purpose about XYZ, whatever it could be. And they basically want to lead sometimes a 3, 4, 5 hour long, different workshops with other staff members that might have an interest. So one that our staff members did was about just, clean clean moisturizers, clean shampoos. And
Mm.
5 or 6 of the women on our team did this and went through this 6-week course. 2 of the guys on our team read this book called Alter Ego. And Alter Ego is the study of how athletes, performers have sometimes created for themselves characters that they become in moments of impact that they need to make
Yeah.
sure that they are shifting who they are. And 2 examples where Kobe Bryant was always known as Black Mamba. So in clutch time, 2 minutes, when he played for the Lakers, he would turn on this like
Mm.
identity of the Black Mamba who was going to, step on your throat and score and win. And it helped him win all these titles. The other one that the book talked about was Beyonce, who has this character known as Sasha Fierce, where when she's on stage, she's not Beyonce anymore. She's
Mm.
now this character and performing, and it allows her to make all the moves she makes. And so the challenge to all of us was like, hey, what alter ego or what's the moment of impact that you can identify as you need to show up differently and work on it? And one of the ones, I'm not afraid to share my alter ego that I discovered after 4 or 5, was from working all day, but from bedtime, from dinner time, 5 o'clock, till bedtime, 8 o'clock, with 4 kids. I was allowing the mental drain, the emotional drain of the day to make me a lesser version of the dad that I wanted to be that was showing up. And if you pulled my kids, they probably, Joe, would not say like, yeah, dad's a loser or dad didn't do this. But it was, hey, dad, can we go in the rain? Dad, can we go throw a ball? Dad, can we go do this? And it was like, no, no, no. Like I gotta go do this, or
Right.
I got these responsibilities, go play with the other neighborhood kids. And they didn't think anything of it. But I discovered that my moment of impact was these 3 hours. And so when I started to think about my alter ego, you have to think about like people, things, and objects that you think manifest the person you're trying to become. This could be
Yep.
for work or for home, plus the actions that you want to show up. And it puts you through this like really cool like experience of like naming people, naming things and moments. And then you combine those, or you try to find basically like the commonalities to come up with this name that embodies all of it. And the one that I discovered is that my kids absolutely love the new Willy Wonka movie.
Mm.
They cannot watch it enough. He is
Right.
creative, he's whimsical, he dances, and every day they would watch Willy Wonka 3 times a day. And so when I started thinking about actions that I'd want to show up, I want to be a dreamer. I want to be creative. I want to be
Mm.
whimsical. I don't want to allow life to hold me down. And the one word that I came up with was wonder. So when you think about my alter ego, I was able to combine the idea of Willy, not Wonka, but Willy Wonder. And it's been this little mental shift for me that, and I apologize if my dog's going nuts in the background.
No
Somebody's
problem.
outside. But what I discovered, and this is what I had to do, this might sound ridiculous, Steve. Why are you sharing this? Is because I needed an actual shift mentally to go do the things that I didn't always feel like doing.
Mm.
And so this has manifested that when I come home, what I'll actually do is close my bedroom door, take off my work shirt because it is an expression that
Mm.
I'm getting rid of the work day,
Yep.
and I'll put on clothes that you would normally play in, and I literally tell myself, Steve, it's time for Willy
That's
Wonder
great.
to show up. And it sounds stupid, it
No,
sounds
no, no, not at
elementary,
all.
but it shifts my mind from I'm not building a business, I'm not reaching out to clients, I'm not podcasting. My kids need me right now,
Yeah.
and I need to manifest the qualities that my kids are going to want to have. And so like my group's always like, hey, did Willy Wonder show up this week? And I'm like, oh, he did. This turned into me riding
I love
scooters
it.
the other night with my
Yeah.
kids, which I would have normally said like, no, I'm going
Yeah,
to
I
go do
know.
this. It's this little mental thing that when my kids are like, dad, can we go run around and play cops and robbers, that I'm like, I'm getting older, my legs hurt, that I'm like, you know what, it's Willy Wonder time. And I just go nuts. And so for me, that's what's worked as my alter ego. But Joe, is there anything in your world, you sound fairly disciplined, but in
Mm.
leading companies and interviewing people on chasing tomorrow, have there been any consistent ways to kind of get unstuck that, like my alter ego, could be a solution? Go read that book. Or has there been anything in your world that either you personally or you've discovered through guests, losing all this weight, overcoming things? Like, have there been things that have helped people jumpstart the life they want to live?
Oh, yeah, of course. There's a lot of techniques. And first, I appreciate you sharing that because I think that being silly is human, and play is human. And these are good skills for us to develop. I mean, they serve us in every element of our lives. So, um, and, uh, the guy who just says no doesn't really add much value, but the guy who says yes has a lot of value, right? And so, so kudos to what you're doing. I think that the key first is, sort of back to having patience, but you have to know what you want to become and where you want to go. Outcomes are really helpful to, really getting to the goals that we want. And I think that every person I talked to said, I've defined sort of a future state of what I want to be. I don't like what I am today. And then it could be at the highest level of performance or just sort of survivability. But that's back to your why, right? Identifying it. I call it an outcome. Some people call it a why. What's the goal? And then we can build a plan that gets us to that. And I think that that's what happens. Along the way, the struggle is fine, accept that happens. People, I feel, start to enjoy and appreciate the struggle because they see growth through struggle, right? It's like the word failure equals growth, really. And the easiest way to think about it is a muscle, right? If I lift the weight to failure, well, it actually means that the muscle needs to then go develop some more muscle so I can lift the weight. So failure is growth. And it's this constant reframing. And then it's also, this idea of, like, which we've talked about, the community part of it, being isolated doesn't serve us for a long, long period of time. We have to be connected to something. That's what humans are really good at. And so, I found that they always found some community support. They always found someone who had their back. Like, in my personal life, my partner, my wife of many, many years, she wants me to be the best version of myself. She's always celebrating me. She's not trying to change me. Even if she doesn't like what I'm doing, she's always supportive, And so finding people who are there because it's going to be hard, who are there to support you because of you, is another element of the success path. And then what you give back to them is, sort of the openness of the communication. You say to people, look, it's going to take this amount of time, or I'm going to go out and do this. Do you mind if I do that? Having this sort of respect for each other, even if, your partner is always going to say yes. Anthea always plays pickleball. She says, I'm going to go play pickleball. Do you mind? Like, of course, I'd never say no. But it's just this respect for each other, right? And I think if we do that, it all builds towards this success paradigm. One of the things, Steve, I was listening, I wanted to just mention that I think is another technique to building successful relationships. So when you have a tough day, you're going to probably have the tendency to take out some other element on some unwitting victim. Call them your family, your kids, your friends. And so I found when I had a really tough day as a CEO, sometimes what I would do is I would come home and I would say, I had a really tough day. If I say anything dumb in the next hour, let's just chalk it up to it was a tough day. And then if you do, then everyone sort of chuckles and laughs, and they don't take it like you're attacking them because they know it was some other reason. And it just, my gosh, it just saved so many misunderstandings by acknowledging how you're feeling. Then everyone's like, oh, okay, that'll probably roll over soon enough, blow over. And now we save ourselves from that. And I think that this open dialogue that we have with each other, the other technique that I always liked was, especially if you're a parent with small kids, and imagine one of the parents, came home and the house is a mess, and then they would sort of accuse the other person of not cleaning up. Well, like maybe it was a pretty tough day. And instead of like saying, why didn't you clean up? Why don't you just clean up for the person? Like, why don't you just do that? Because it's bothering you. It didn't bother them, clearly. Like for me, I never liked dishes in the sink. So I would just wash them. And then I solved the problem. It was never anyone else's problem. I didn't create the problem. And I was like, oh, wow. Instead of an argument, you solve a problem, make it easier for someone else. And then, boy, life gets a lot easier from sort of this acknowledgement of circumstance, how you show up, what you do about it. In that, it does really improve relationships over time.
Yeah. One of the quotes I got back to is I normally have right, behind my shoulder, I take it out when I record, is a Peloton bike. It was one thing that my wife, when we relocated to Tennessee, really wanted to have.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always thought like I would never be able to do a stationary bike, but here I am finding coaches that motivate me for the 15, 20, 30 minutes
Mm-hmm.
to get on the bike. And when you're on a Peloton, many of these coaches will start the show or the experience of the ride with life quotes to get you going.
Yeah.
And one of the coaches, Ben, says, and I don't know if it was his quote or he took it from somebody else, but he says, how you do anything is how you do everything.
Yep.
And when I really think about that quote and what you just said about the dishes and the story of that and tough days, when you're married, you are hopefully married to your best friend and biggest supporter, but sometimes it doesn't always feel that way. And it's easy to come home if you have one spouse who stays home or you're out of it, where what is bothering you, like you said, may not bother the other person. And we can create problems because we want them to be as impassioned as we are as to like, why aren't things cleaned? Or why aren't you doing things doing it? But what you just said is true. Like, what is stopping you from stepping in and doing it? And how you do anything is how you do everything. So whether it's, writing down the 10 push-ups and 1 mile for 25 seconds, or how long are dishes really going to take you? 7 minutes? Could
Yeah.
you not put on music or your favorite podcast, like Chasing Tomorrow, and listen to individuals? Like, what is really stopping you as a person from doing the thing that's bothering you? And it's a simple mantra. So far, I've given you Willy Wonder. My other one is this quote that I say to myself when I end up, probably my wife and I together pick up our house 5 times a day
Mm.
because we have an 8-year-old, a 7-year-old, and twin girls that are 4. We would love for them to put out the thing they just brought out of their bedroom into the living room, or the pair of roller blades that are in the middle of our kitchen. Like, in again, if you're not careful, you can find yourself becoming so mad at the people that are you think are causing this pain to you or this distraction in your day, when the reality is, yeah, I could coach them to pick this up and harp on them and harp on them. Or how hard is it going to be to actually pick this up? And that doesn't mean that you neglect the discipline of being a parent and trying to work with them.
Mm.
But what I found is that, again, when I'm in seasons of not feeling great about myself, feeling isolated, being tired, that could be tired physically, emotionally, spiritually, financially. It's easy to cut corners. And the thing that maybe you should pick up that's in the hallway, you can just like walk by. And when you take that mental shift and it's like, you know what? No, I'm going to go back. And even sometimes it's going back. That is where sometimes I have found personally that the greatest breakthroughs have come through
Mm.
is, again, walk up to the thing, or you have this activity and you're like, I don't want to do it. And you start going past it. When you can, however long you get past that thing, tell yourself, like, Steve, go back and pick it up.
Yeah.
I'm
And I
not going
think,
to tweet about it. I'm not going to write about it, but it does something to me when I do that. But go ahead.
yeah. No, I think it's to seek to understand, right? This, don't judge. No one's doing anything to you, Steve. Like, your kid is leaving them or not doing them to do something to you, right? That's just their circumstance. And I think at work, in our personal lives, we often, I like this saying, which is, in the absence of information, we create a false narrative.
Hmm.
And so we so fast go to this bad conclusion. Oh, the reason why someone didn't call me is because they didn't want to call me. Well, maybe something else was in the way. The reason why, like, my son, daughter were left their stuff in the way was they wanted to make me angry. These are just not true at all. And so what we have to do is give grace to the circumstance. And if we are here as servants, the other thing that Simon Sinek talks about is the servant leader. And like, well, how would you describe a servant leader? The servant leader is the person who actually takes care of all of those issues without looking for credit, right? You're not going to go to your kid and say, oh, by the way, I picked up your rollerblades, check one for me. No, 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 no. That's not what we're here. We're here to serve each other, you know, lead with grace, understand that sometimes whatever happened is the reason it happened. We don't need to judge it. And actually, interestingly enough, what you found is that we feel better too, right? Because
Hmm.
then we realize we're actually serving our deeper purpose here. Our deeper purpose is not just about, maximizing our own lifetime. When we get to this idea of self-actualization, it's about, how we have made the world a better place, that our purpose and meaning comes from serving deeper and more broadly to others, right? That is where we feel the most valued and the most value to ourselves. And so, yes, building yourself into a strong person is really important. It allows us to take the burden on. but then we need to use that in service to others. And, there's a theory that says in the first third of your life, you learn, in the second third of your life, you earn, and in the last third of your life, you return. But I think that we need to sort of do that throughout, that it's not just always in these thirds, and the only time that we return is when we're in the last third of our lives. I think we should always be thinking about what are we giving back? Because imagine what this world is like if everyone's doing that. And we can still be commercial, and we can still have capitalism, and all of those things can serve in markets. But, if we're all here serving each other, whether it's picking up the rollerblades, washing the dishes, holding the door for someone, helping someone on a project at work, every time you give, you get back. And I think that's the power of what I've learned.
Yeah, and I think with that point, it's the idea of the overflow. If you are in a bad mental state because you had to pick up your home, but you're on your way out the door and you're leaving frustrated, and you get to go to your local coffee shop and meet with Joe for the first time, friend introduced you to each other, you're going to talk about coming on each other's podcasts. But when you show up, you brought something from the last moment of your life that's bothering you. It doesn't allow you to necessarily be fully present. And Joe, you might be sharp enough, which I think you would be, to maybe recognize in me like, hey, you doing okay? Because I'm not going to be able to fully be my authentic self if I had a bad conversation with my wife right before I left, or my kids, or just like I said, I don't feel great about myself. I don't feel like I look good, or my pants fit a little bit tighter today. All those things can affect you. And so I wonder how many of us are bringing things into moments that don't belong there,
Hmm.
that might be actually limiting the opportunities in front of us. Because if you and I meet and we have an unbelievably fun, we're building into each other time, it's two men getting together, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of collaborations. But if I'm there and it's more of a counseling session that was never supposed to be, where you're like, what's wrong? And I'm like, well, how much time do you have? And I rob that moment of the ability to be fully present with you. I just wonder how many of us are guilty of bringing things into work that happened at home, bringing things from home, and the opposite. And there are maybe doors of opportunity that are being presented to you all the time that you may not be getting the most of because of the things that you're not addressing that don't belong in that moment, but have its proper time and place. And that's one of the things that I think you learned, that you talked about, was being patient and learning how to work through it. And so, was there anything else like in what you're saying? Because there's so much depth to this conversation today, and you seem to be so, light in the way that you approach life. But again, whether it's running a company or your own podcast, do you think that there's anything, especially when it comes to health? This is one thing that I was talking about. Many couples come to me and say, for example, I want to be healthy, but my spouse really doesn't care about eating or taking care of themselves. Like, how do you also, it's great that your wife supports you and you guys are championing each other. But what about those people that maybe you have a spouse that is starting to feel better, look better, and it's creating distance between them and their spouse because they're taking care of themselves? Like, how could we also inspire and encourage couples to maybe take some baby steps to doing something together, or to cultivate that supportive relationship to help them both get out of it? Hey everyone, Steve Campbell. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If it's made an impact on you, I would love to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode. But I would also love for you to leave a 5-star rating and review. Your ratings and review help other listeners know that this show is worth their time. So thank you so much for tuning into The One Big Thing, and let's enjoy the rest of the episode.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and probably not the simplest answer, but I'll start with this idea. If you don't like the way something feels, you shouldn't do that to someone else. Okay, so imagine if you turned it around and you were the other person, and that very fit person says to you, like, well, why don't you just get out and run? Like, how would that feel? You would never want to feel that way. So you
Yep.
should never say that to someone, right? You should never treat someone like the way you don't want to be treated. And we often do this. And so even as a parent, now my kids are adults, and I'm like, oh boy, I don't like when I was nagged. I'm not going to do that. And so just always keep that little process running in your head. What you're going to say to someone, be careful. So I think it comes down to trying to then explore with someone, what do they want to do? making time and space for that. Back to actually my wife and I run. She doesn't like running. She likes playing paddle sports. That's what she likes to do. So we don't do them together per se. We can, but don't. And it's being supportive of people's different interests. And so I think that it's about helping people sort of build the version of who they want to be by being supportive of that. Now, I don't think that we can break down, someone who's really struggling in a short period of time, other than giving people the grace and the patience to be able to take enough time to get to the place that you want to get to. Usually you see the end of the story, like, oh, look at this guy, he's running 4,000 miles and doing 100,000 push-ups, but like it was a struggle throughout. It wasn't, it's 20 years. It's not like it happened in a week. And so I think that doing that is important. The third thing is we should always say nice things to each other. We really I'm sure, Steve, you figure this out, but if you don't say I love you to your wife, even though she knows it, it's great when she hears that, right? I say that to my kids all the time. We always use that language. It never gets old. And so if any of our friends, even a friend that you didn't see, wow, you look great, you know, anything positive is really helpful to making people feel good about themselves, right? And so we're here to support and encourage and then open up an ability to have a dialogue, right? Hey, I'm here. If you want to ask me something, I'm happy to help. I'll stop anything I'm doing if you would like me to help. Just tell me and then leave it there. Don't keep pressing on it. And then one day someone's going to say to you, hey, by the way, do you have a couple of minutes? Can you explain this to me? And so I find that because I've explored a lot of it, I do get asked about nutrition, about sleep, and about mindset and community and exercise because I've become a practitioner. But I never force it on anyone. I'm not here campaigning for how people should live. I'm living the way that I should. Maybe I'm a role model, but I make myself available in a supportive way. And so that does sort of bring the level down of sort of emotion and intensity so that we can get to a good place. Steve, the predominance of this podcast is about these life lessons. It's not like we need to have gone to Harvard and get a PhD in something. Like this is about showing up the best way we can as people through the struggle. Hey, look, I had the struggle. I still know I have the struggle, but it's this acceptance of this journey and getting excited about it and the possibilities and doing that more broadly that actually makes it very rewarding. The last thing I would say is that when, like, for example, back to my daughters, they are living their life, but I've provided to them an ability to use me for what they need. Like, hey, Dad, I'm making some financial decisions. You know a lot about that. Can you help me? Right? You don't have to be involved in a lot, but you can be available for parts of it. And I think that it's always fun to be able to do and sort of what you're good at with other people, friends, community, family. Make yourself available, share what you know. We all can benefit from each other. And that's how we build out that other element of the 5 pillars of, living really a best life we can.
Yeah, and I love how an episode comes full circle. You started this episode by saying that there was a time in your life that you struggled financially, moved in with your parents, got your car stolen, and now your daughters are coming to you saying, Dad, you're really good with this stuff. So just because of where you are doesn't mean that that's the end of the story.
That's right.
And so I think it'd be a fascinating, Joe, we didn't talk about this, but because people come to you about nutrition, there is so much information that's out there today for individualized, that's commercialized, that things like going a keto route or going a carnivore route or
Yep.
going, a vegan route. And so much of it is somebody's point of view trying to sell you something, supplements, a way of living. If somebody was looking for maybe a way of doing things, is it more about following, in your world, a specific nutritional plan like keto, or more the discipline to jumpstart you? If there is an area of nutrition, is there anything that you've done over the last 25 years, nutrition wise, that you said, hey, for me and my body, for others I've helped, like this is a way that I go about doing it?
Yeah, I think that our system, um, let's index it at 100. How much stress we put on it takes away some of our energy, whatever that is. It could be work stress, food stress, any kind of stress. And so, one of the ways of stressing our system is by putting food in our body that's not really healthy. So, over processed foods that have certainly better if you get a packaged food with less than 7 ingredients. But if something has more than 15 ingredients, don't buy it, don't eat it. Your body is going to be working so hard against sort of all that over processed chemicals that are in there. So, whole foods. I don't care if you are a meat eater or a vegan, whole foods really, really matter more. There's 21 meals in the week, Steve. It isn't about perfection in 21 meals. That's 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. I try to aim for 16 or 17 where you're eating better, color on the plate, real food, that has a lot less processed ingredients to it. So that's number one, because what that does is both we metabolize it better and we put less stress on our body, right? And same thing. Look, you can have a drink, that's fine. Doesn't matter one way or the other. But if you have 5 drinks, you're stressing your system. So just be careful because all the stress takes away against our capability. The second thing is that these energy systems in the balance, a lot of what we buy in the stores are just pure carbohydrates. We got to eat more protein. Protein builds muscle. Muscle builds resiliency. Resiliency brings vitality. That makes us stronger and better over our time and our lives. Focus on protein. You have to do that. Otherwise, you'll never get to the goal. And if you just thought about it in a day, could you get to 100 grams of protein? Minimally, that would be a good place to start, even if that's a protein shake. But then look at the ingredients. So always be an informed consumer. And then the third thing is, yeah, there are other diets and forms. I think some of them work well for us. This idea of a ketogenic diet, some people don't react well. If you try something or the Whole30 diet, if they don't work for you, stop. Like
Yep.
your body is telling you. Our bodies know who we are, and we're all different in that way. So, start with whole foods, eat less processed foods. Think about having the predominance of our meals be good meals, especially if you figure out ones that really work for you. Like I'm a guy of habit. I can eat the same thing every lunch, every day, and just love it. But then, and then have some fun with it. I'm not a person of moderation, clearly, because I do a lot, but I think it's about intelligence. It's about being smart about what we do. And then we'll actually see a vast improvement. Since 1960 through now, we've increased, the average weight of Americans by 30%. That isn't because of anything other than overprocessed foods and eating too much. So, we can turn the clock back on that by the choices we make. And yes, some people might say it's too expensive, but actually, if you buy frozen vegetables, they're not that expensive. You can move one day to organic, that would be better. Um, but it is just about look how you're fueling yourself, how you're showing up. You feel better, you'll sleep better, your body's less under stress, and it ultimately makes you a better performer in every element of your life. So yeah, I think nutrition is critically important. And maybe the last point, Steve, is if you don't know anything about it, read, talk to people who know something, make your own informed judgments, try it and see how it works. And if it works, then please keep doing it because there's no reason to, um, do something that anyone else wants you to do. This is your life. Live your life.
Very helpful impact recap that you just gave there, Joe. Because if you're not happy with yourself, there's enough sponsored ads on Facebook and Google that will show you people in shape and just take this overnight pill and you'll lose 30 pounds. And again, when you're desperate for change, those things can become kind of enticing. Like I'm willing to try it. And I think what you just laid out, which I'll just tell you about my own personal journey and what's helped me more so as the host of the show. And it's when I do this, it helps me quite a bit. I have found that with 4 kids, one of the big things is the amount of water I intake every day, making sure that I'm taking care of myself with enough water. I don't really drink, a lot of the sugar energy drinks, anything like that. But water, black coffee has helped me, but also meal prepping. If I can be intentional about how I'm going to the store and what I'm buying, I had read one time in a nutrition book that typically you want to stay to the outside of the store. Anything that's in the middle is where, you get a lot of the processed foods. But if I'm intentional, like you said, about setting out your clothes the night before, if I'm intentional about, hey, I got so many meals this week and I know that I got baseball at night, or I'm with my kids, or I'm going from meeting to meeting, if I can on Saturday or Sunday meal prep, and like you, I am somebody that can eat the same thing 3 times a day and love it. The challenge is, though, my kids and my wife don't feel the same way. So this is where I go back to, if you are an individual or a couple who's not satisfied with where you are, put a why behind what you're trying to do. And before you jump into anything, do your research. Begin to look up different types of eating. I know individuals that will try to stay under a certain amount of calories every day, but the calories they do eat are awful and they don't know why their body's not changing.
Yeah.
So we don't truthfully understand the amount of protein that you're taking in every day and high quality micronutrients and macronutrients, how much they can change you. We could probably have an hour-long conversation about life hacks and things you can do, but this is why I want to put Joe's information in the show notes so that
Yep.
if you feel stuck, you don't have to stay there.
Mm.
There are some real things that you can do to begin to see transformation in your life, but you are the only one that's going to be able to do it. There's not a person, there's not a supplement, there's not a one thing that you can do that's going to get you from where you are today to where you are. But the beautiful thing about Joe's story is how he started this show to how he's ended, and the life lessons he's learned the way. Take and apply all of these to your life, realizing that it's not a one size fits all. A way that you eat versus somebody else, as long as you're doing the things with the disciplines and you're training yourself and parenting, there's not a one size fits all with parenting. But you got to be able to put a why behind things and do enough research to figure out, are there apps, are there resources, are there books, are there people like Joe that I could be watching or modeling myself after? There is more information that's out there today. I think the challenge that we all have is sifting through or navigating information to know what is actually real, what's truth, and what can help us versus what is mindless stuff that is actually taking away and eroding the people that we are. And so, Joe, I don't know if I had even asked you this. If you're not prepared, we'll just skip it and cut it
Mm.
out of this show. But I always like to end the one big thing with an exercise I call start, stop, continue. I ask each guest to think about one thing they want to start doing, one thing that they'd like to stop doing, and one thing that they would like to continue doing. If I put you on the spot and said, Joe, are there 3 things you think you want to work on? Are you prepared enough to maybe share what each one of those may be?
Yeah, sure. What I want to start doing is making more time for vacation.
Mm,
I can work too much. So, what I want to stop doing is, just being focused on only career development, and continuing to round out my life. And continue doing is my focus on health and wellness, with the idea of, health span being a gift that I'm going to give both to myself, my family, and my community by showing up better over the years to come. So I have a lot still to work on. Steve, I do appreciate being on the show and getting to share this. It's been a fun and enjoyable conversation. And so thanks for that.
yeah. And if you are a family friend of Joe's or here for the first time, again, I hope you'll go back and listen to other episodes. If what Joe talked about at the end, one episode that I did was called Life After Sugar with Netta Gorman, where she talked about, kind of like Joe said, the whole health initiative and cutting sugars out. And so there are people's stories that can inspire you, to encourage you to live your best life. Again, Joe, thank you for being my guest on my show. We will put information in the show notes about Chasing Tomorrow, as
Great.
well as if you'd like people to be able to get a hold of you.
Mhm.
But thanks for being a part of this journey with me, listeners. Thank you for tuning into the One Big Thing podcast, where I'm here to help you move the ball forward in your life.
Thank you.